So welcome back, and we're going to immediately note this, which we mentioned a few times in the past few classes in association with this Igeres HaKodesh Chof, which we're just simply determined not to skip it. The reason why there was a decision like that, because perhaps there's a reason, yes, to skip it, because it's complicated, it's nuanced, very detailed, Kabbalistic, very distinct than all the other Igeres HaKodesh before this Chaf. Even though Yutes, we entered somewhat in something similar, spirited, but nothing close, and all the other Igeres HaKodesh after it, all of them, as you could attest to the Igeres HaKodesh up till now. There was a certain flow to, as we mentioned, to avoid Tanya. One has to put his mind to it, toil, but then when you do so, there's something seamless which flows as you learn. In other words, the learning, the study, the message, the insight is something which is attainable, and one doesn't have to look at it as something, deep, abstract, and so on, because it's all message which, again, with effort, like every area in Torah, one has to be omol b'Torah, but when you're omol b'Torah, you receive the information, you seek it, you toil and you find, you believe, and so too in every area. And when it comes to Tanya, particularly Tanya, I would even add, but nonetheless, you've had the matzasa, it's an easy flow, and the message was easy one way or another to adapt to. But when it came to Yutes a little bit, namely Chav, it's a different idea completely, by far. The only similarity of a chapter like this is in Kuntre Sachen, the fifth chelik, the fifth segment of Tanya. We know Tanya, there's 5 segments, and which is L'Kutei Amarim, Sheikhut B'Emunah, Igeres HaTshuva, Igeres HaKodesh, which we're presently learning. And then Kuntre Sachen, there's one chapter in Kuntre Sachen which is similar to this. But throughout the entire Tanya, up till now, and as Hashem and after, there's not even compared. There's nothing even similar to these 2 chapters. So, because it was so complicated, and again, we merited to learn up till here, and one can attest that, v'chazdi Hashem, v'chaninas Hashem, Hashem's grace, we're able to toil and explain and appreciate our own and explain it, and we reached this the 4th segment. In other words, we completed B'chazdi Hashem, the first 3, and quite a bit made a headway into this 4th segment, Igeres HaKodesh. We do mention from time to time, this is with precision, so Tzedek notes, because the 5 segments, the reason for the 5 segments, because Tanya Kadisha is known to be the Torah Shebiksav of Torah's Chassidus, Chassidus Chabad, again written by the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, called Chabad because in the end of the day, the Alter Rebbe wanted to fuse the Elokus, which by definition is transcendent of human intellect and human comprehension, human appreciation, and to fuse it together to be able to introduce it to the human mind. That was the revolutionary, that's why the Alter Rebbe study, the Alter Rebbe's Limud, Alter Rebbe's Torah was revolutionary, because he took the deepest parts of Pnimis HaTorah and he made it understandable with a human intellect, Chochma Bina Das, and as such, like human intellect could understand everything else they come across in their life, and they appreciate it. And when you appreciate something, your approach to it is totally different than when it's a blind subject. Even it's inherently good, inherently complementary, inherently contributes to so many ideas, but you can't really appreciate it, and you can't be passionate about it if you don't understand it, or at least adequately understand it. Or in other words, at least on intellectually, adequately on an intellectual plane, but then how much more so when it has an impact on your emotions, which usually it does when you understand something thoroughly, so it has an impact on your emotions. By nature, it's ilav va'ol, it's cause and effect. You understand something thoroughly, it has an impact, how much you're driven to it. your emotions, each emotion, each attribute on its own, how it relates to something that you appreciate in your mind, intellectually. So the Alter Rebbe did this with the whole idea of Pnimis HaTeira, or Chassidus Chabad, starting from the Tanya. The Alter Rebbe took the deepest ideas of Teira and fused it with the Chabad Chochmah Bin Adas of the soul of the person, particularly the soul of the Yid. And as such, of course, it's a game changer, the whole person's approach to Elokus, to the godly reality, the Teira reality, mitzvahs, especially the information the Alter Rebbe shares with us, what Teira is, what mitzvahs. I mean, you have to learn and become excited, and it's inevitable that you will. Every subject which the Alter Rebbe spoke about is a game changer. Even these overall segments, the Shari Yichud Memuna, the idea of oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one studies Shari Yichud Memuna thoroughly, of course, with his Chochmah Bin Adas, his Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad will never be the same, and not stem just a bit different, a bit distinct. It's a different idea, a revolutionary. It's not at all. There's no comparison to any way the person appreciated Hashem Echad prior. Probably never said any sefer he learned, and then which explains these ideas. Of course, there's so many similarities in other svarim, but the idea how the Rebbe brings it out so clear. The Rebbe had a certain way of demonstrating something, made everything so real, which is, of course, the most important part. It's not a subject. It's not about information. It's about transformation. That's what the Alter Rebbe's gift of presentation. And so to get us a tshuva, greatest gift Am Yisrael has, which is the gift Hashem says you can do tshuva, even though you derail, you can get back on, you could align yourself with me, says Hashem, which is of course the greatest gift which we could ever think of. But then tshuva, there's so many levels, there's so many, in order to appreciate what tshuva is all about, and what happens through sin that you correct through tshuva. I mean, again, you learn to get us a tshuva, your appreciation for tshuva will never be the same. That's what the Alter Rebbe did in everything he wrote. And then he gets HaKadosh, which even though it's distinct, it's letters, it's epistles written different times, different attending to different ideas, even though eventually and written to certain communities, even though in the end of the day the Alter Rebbe wrote it to all of our nation, eventually becomes a timeless message to all of Am Yisrael, to all of Klal Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe wrote at a certain time. The Tanya Kadisha will one day become Nachlas HaKlal, as we sing it more and more evidently as we come closer to Yemei Mashiach. And this in itself, the whole idea of Chassidus Chabad was a preview into the Yedias Elokus, as the Rambam writes, the end of Mishnah Torah, that the whole Isei Azman, the Isei Kol Ha'olam, is Ledas, as Hashem, in order to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so this was a entry into that. That was the whole Isneitzutz of the Baal Shem Tov, but namely the Malamakim, his Malamakim, the Midrash, but namely the Alter Rebbe, Chassidus Chabad, the idea that the human intellect can appreciate and understand Elokus. Yedias Hashem, it's not just Emunas Hashem. It's about knowledge. Das is totally different. You see in the end of chapter 3, in Likutei Amorim, the difference of Das and Chochmah Bina. In any case, when it comes to this chapter, it's all different. It's a very lofty subject, very lofty ideas, the entire chapter for that matter. So we had, so there was an idea maybe to skip it. But then we felt, let it be a complete idea. And we're going to understand however, the maximum we're going to put into it, in other words, of course, to explain it to the maximum ability. Again, with Chazdei Hashem, Chaninas Hashem, but nonetheless, in the onset, we're saying this very clearly, and we'll get through it. It's a lengthier chapter. We're going to have some patience, or a lot of patience, but with Bez Hashem and a good show, we'll get through it, and we'll try to understand. And in the end of the day, these are concepts which ultimately will help us throughout any subject of Pnimis HaTeira one will learn. This is information which, of course, someone gains at learning it itself. The Alter Rebbe is saying a message over here. There's an idea the Alter Rebbe is conveying, but learning this is important on its own, because besides it's one of the Geras the Alter Rebbe wrote. He wrote this. The Alter Rebbe wrote these Geras very close to his passing in this world. He doesn't say a few hours, say a few days before, but it was right towards the end. Again, there's a backdrop to that also. in any case, so we're holding on page Kuf. So we get made a decision that we're gonna go through it. Let's try to together understand whatever we can, and we'll do our best to partner with our listeners to make it somewhat understandable and appreciated on some level, and we'll move on. Shkayach. So we are holding a page Kuf Lamed, and one thing we do mention from time to time, we always mention. Yigeres HaKodesh is distinct from all the other segments. It's letters, epistles. There's 32 of them. There's many other letters, but this is 32, which made into Sefer Tanya Kedusha with by design, by choice. And from Bnei Agoy Mechaber, the children of the Alter Rebbe, we spoke about this as well. But an overall presentation we had about the backdrop of Yigeres HaKodesh in Yigeres HaKodesh 10, which is 10 back, the beginning of Yud. We had a kind of a more of a full package, somewhat presentation of what Yigeres HaKodesh is all about. The backdrop of it, associated with the Aliyah Mendel Haradaka as well. Tzedakah, even though we did mention certainly Yigeres HaKodesh, it doesn't even mention the word tzedakah, but on the overall, there is the common thread. We run through all the Yigeres. Again, you got to look there. Now, we said look there wherever you're learning, in other words, wherever you see the shir, but there's which we always mention, of course, this just because the technicality of it, the way we're able to access the previous classes is a little more simple, because this is the whole website is set up in this way that it's easy to access all the previous classes. TanyaOnline.com is the original website, TanyaOnline.com. Tanya Online, one word, .com. And you have all the previous classes set up on the left side of the screen. And it's from top to bottom, means that the latter classes are on top. In other words, I think this is the fourth or fifth class in this Yigeres, so that's the ones on top, and then you go down till the very beginning of Likutei Amarim, for that matter, the first segment. Also, the text is set up in a separate scroll bar, such easy to follow. And so even this very Yigeres, if you're new to, you want to know a little bit what's happening, and you want to start from the beginning, it's a click away. Everything's a click away. And Alter Rebbe himself, we do mention from time to time, Alter Rebbe himself cross references from one to the other, and namely from one segment to the other, like I wrote in Likutei Amarim or Shaykh B'Emunah or Yigeres HaKshuv as an example, namely for the former. We cross-reference many times if something is discussed elaborately in one segment or one class. So we just, especially today, it's really a click away. It takes a few seconds, and you see the corresponding text which that idea was explained. So we just try to send you over there. It just makes perfect sense instead of taking time in the present class again over chewing this idea which is already explained expansively in other areas. So it's just look there, look at this chapter, look in the center of this chapter, the beginning of this chapter. It's a click away and you can see it. So this is the advantage of technology, also associated with Ma'aseh Mashiach. Remember this famous Zayar, 2,000 years ago the Zayar was written. 2,000 years ago, yeah, the Zayar was written about 2,000 years ago. Shim Bar Yochai, and he writes that the 600th year in the final millennia is going to be the quotes a pasuk in Parshas Noach, the Mayonis Hashamayim and Mayonis Haaretz, Arubis Hashamayim and Mayonis Haaretz are going to open up. It's spiritual Gilui, and also from the perspective of Haaretz, which are, of course, one is going to complement. This is going to complement, in other words, which we saw clearly that in the 600th year, that's when technology developed, namely the 600-year point, and then we had the Teres Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, the Chochmah Nistora, as he writes there. So this is, in the end of the day, the Chochmah Dalamata, technology is there for the purpose to disseminate the messages of Lukus, of Torah, of mitzvahs, and so on. So even now, the idea that you, with a click, you can see everything you want to in, of course, in matters of Kedusha, Shir, another Shir. But even in a particular class, it's set up in a way that when something is discussed, let's say in Shaykh B'Emunah Peri Gimel, Shaykh B'Emunah Peri Gimel, it's a few seconds, go down to that class and you open it up and it's all there. So we are holding again, we said Kuf Lamed, V'chein Neshamis Ach Neshamis HaMalachim. Excuse me, it's a little over the center of the page. Ach Neshamis HaMalachim. So what did we spoke about before? Yeah, it's right on top of the screen. You can see the last week's class, and basically speaks about the difference of Ilu and Olu and Yesh Me'ayin, the Bria of Yesh Me'ayin, a different idea. There is a certain dissonance between the Nivra and the Baire, even though the Emes, the Baire, has no independability. It's all dependent on the Baire. Now, the Nivra is constantly dependent on the Baire every single second. Remember, we have to repeat, Cholim taught me every moment, every second. The Eil, the Baire, is Mahaba Machayim Mekayim, gives life and existence to the Nivra, but nonetheless, the Nivra doesn't sense that, and it stands kind of as a separate entity. And it was created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu by design, because Nis'ab HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he wants the Yid to be Megala, to reveal the Emes Hashem Leilam. So it was created in that fashion, as opposed to Ilav Olu, all cause and effect. The effect always appreciates its cause. There's a certain closeness as he goes on. As he explained, that is, as opposed to the Bria Yesh Mi'ayin, it's by the, in other words, the ex nihilo phenomenon is that the Nivra, the created being, is created in such a way that it doesn't recognize its source, its creator. Even though the creator is constantly, it's not that it created 6,000 years ago. You see at the time of creation, in other words, 5,700, from the very beginning of 6 days of creation, you see that stone on top of the mountain. You say, "Oh, that was created so many thousands of years ago," and and it's just standing there. Probably it came into being because of Hashem, but its connection to Hashem today, yeah, it's connected to Hashem not only today, but every minute, every second, every millisecond. Hashem is pumping energy into it, and the only reason why it exists as even a stone, even by the daimon, the inanimate. Saying this briefly, we spoke about this so many times in the past, but even in the context of this page, it's because Hashem is giving it chai. That's why it exists. And Hashem pulls back the life and the energy. It doesn't just become a broken stone, a dark stone, or whatever. It just disappears. So the whole being of the stone is just because Hashem is right now giving it energy. So apparently you would say the stone will just be on its own. The whole stone, the tzias of the stone, will be a demonstration of the oneness, the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because its whole existence, as it, with its image, its style, its character, if you will, the stiffness of the stone, whatever the way it is, it's all because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right now giving it energy and everything about it. It's not only like a battery into I say tape recorder, that's what I grew up with, right? The battery and the tape recorder. So it's making the tape recorder work, but every particle of the tape recorder is not the battery. And therefore, there's a certain independability or a certain identification of the device over the battery. As opposed to here, the whole mitzias of the stone, the way it is just because of Nehava Machayim Mekayim. It's only because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, every bit of every particle of it. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu pulls that back, the stone will turn to nothing, is nothing at all, disappear. So everything about the stone is a lakus. Nonetheless, look at the stone as the stone say, I am an extension or I am a creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, to the contrary, it's saying, here I am, this is who I am, don't talk to me about my source or what's giving me energy. That's the reality, the default reality of the stone, or if it's the water, or if it's even the botanical world. Yes, it's growing, there's life, but this tree is not saying that the reason I'm growing is because Hashem is making me grow. And so too in the chai, in the animal world, and then in the human world. Humans are somewhat the far extreme, which the movement, by default movement of Elam Haza is Leah Eivani, right? Pari, which was the king of the civilized world at the time. It's my Nile and I made it. No, you made nothing because you're Pari, you're a human being, mortal, and there's nothing, you don't have really any strength to create. But that's what the Elam Haza, he says in his mind. There's Leah Eidi Bani Asisani, I made the Nile because he was so connected to the Nile. He said he made it. That's Elam Haza. Pari himself existed because Hashem was giving him chayas. Now that itself you have to understand. If Hashem is giving chayas to a stone, maybe I could understand, but the Pari, and the Pari turned about face to Hashem, even though, he came to that realization that Hashem is really the one in charge. He learned the hard way till he said Hashem Atzadik Bani B'Amir Rishayim, as we said. He says Hashem is the righteous, and he recognized. Eventually, the Torah says V'Edu Mitzrayim Kani Hashem, that not only the Yidden should know, the Yid should know, which that ultimately and of course the Yid's knowledge is much more profound. Basically, there's an Neshama, but Hashem wants the world. Emes Hashem la'olam, Mitzrayim should know V'Edu Mitzrayim Kani Hashem. But that takes work and that takes toil. There's a godly intervention, but namely Hashem give it over to us, that we are Megala, we reveal Emes Hashem la'olam, even though on its own it should really be like that, because the creation is just always every second, every millisecond, depending on the creator. But that's the way Hashem created it. So this is what we see in the previous classes. So Alter Rebbe says something, that there's something in between the Ila Ba'olu and Briya Yesh Mi'ayin. He says these are the Neshamas HaMalachim, because before he spoke about the Gufos HaMalachim, they're part of the Yesh. We spoke about it last class that is. But the Neshamas HaMalachim, Sheyotzu Min Zivig HaNeshikin, it says, in other words, the Neshamas which came more from an intimate setting. There's total. Later he says Neshamas Sheyotzu Min Zivug Duzon, which is not only intimate setting but real intimate connection between the spheres of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which the Neshamas came from, as opposed to the Zivug HaNeshikin, which is somewhat an intimate setting, which the Malachim's Neshamas came from, emanated from. And then he goes on the Neshamas. Again, this is by contrast to the Gufim, in contrast, that is, to the Gufos HaMalachim, which we spoke about last week. See the class last week. Click away. And here he says, besides, and here he's speaking of the Neshamas of Malachim. He says, then the Neshamas of the Adam, of the Yid, which is higher than Malachim, as we know, they came from the Zivik Duzon, the true intimate setting of the Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is Zoh and Malchus, which is the Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is spoken about so many times. We did perhaps over the entire studies speak about this as well, but not going to go into it now. So the Neshamas came from an intimate not only intimate setting, but intimate union of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Midas, which the Neshamas came out from, and because it was based on an intimate establishment, intimate union, so it's also not part of the Bria. It has a connection, a deeper connection with the Elokus, with its source, more than the Bria, the actual creation, in comparison to the Beirei, the Ayin which creates the Yesh. As he says, before they came down to Bria Tzirasiya, which when they came down, then they become part of the Nivra, they adapt a certain veneer of Nivra, Yitzira, and Asiya, but before they came down to Bria Tzirasiya, these Neshamis, they're not part of the Yesh V'Daber, they don't have no Nivra dynamic to them. It's kind of a godly manifestation itself. Of course, with the Tzimtzum Atzim, a great contraction of the purity, unadulterated purity of Elokus, it turned into a neshama. But nonetheless, it is similar to the raw godliness, not a separate entity. It's similar to the unadulterated Elokus. Meaning to say, it says me'ein, meaning to say, it's not mamish part of the Elokus because it became a neshama. Like to understand it very like the connection of a child to a parent. It's not just a certain closeness, it's the mitzias of the child comes from the parents. Now, eventually a child develops on his own. You attribute it very much when the child is born. Like this is an extension of the parent later when the child develops and becomes his own entity, and especially becomes his own personality, and sometimes a personality which sometimes can be conflict with a parent or parents, and so then you don't see so much of the extension because it's a developed entity, which this would be similar to when they come into Bria Tzir Asiya, so then they obtain the idea of a certain veneer of Nivra, Yitzira, or Asiya. You see it when a child is born, in the first few moments is born, you find the extension of the mother for sure, the father. You see that this is and so is it the father and the mother? No, now it's a mitzias on its own, but nonetheless it's a pure extension. It is, that's what he says, the neshama before it comes to biyah, it doesn't have this idea of a nivra yesh me'ayin. No, it's me'ain It's not a lukus. It's not at the adulterated purity of a lukus, but that's me ain the lukus. B'tzimtzumot with great contraction. Okay, and kelim the Yitzviris, like the kelim of the Yitzviris Atzilus themselves. As we said, it spoke so many times. Atzilus is a world which is a lukus mamash, lashon al Rebbe. See the lashon in Peirik, in Lukutei Amorim, in the Sefer Lukutei Amorim, in Peirik Memches. The lashon is, or Memtes. There's the Atzilus is a lukus mamash. We spoke about many times. The world of Atzilus is a world that houses houses the Ein Sof. So these kelim these neshamas are similar to the kelim of Atzilus. Okay, na kelim Atzilus. The line begins. Okay, the kelim Yitzviris Atzilus, which are gvul. And what are their kelim? They're an entity because they come through tzimtzum Ein Sof. The contraction of the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As we know, there's a difference of the Eidos of Atzilus and the Kelim of Atzilus. And we spoke about this quite a few times. It says, in Atzilus, it's all about the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's still, there's a distinction between the Eidos of Atzilus, the light, and then the container. We can appreciate container, there's a certain Hakbala. It limits the light. Like any container limits the substance which goes into the container. Before that, it's all over the place. Then you contain it. That's the Kelim of Atzilus. Does it have maintained that oneness which inherently exists in Atzilus? Yes, of course it does, because it's Atzilus. Hashem and His Eidos are one. This is a world that houses the Ein Sof. And Hashem and His Kelim are one, because it's a world that houses the Ein Sof. But nonetheless, you see the difference. It doesn't say Hashem and His Eidos and His Kelim one. It is a part because it's one level of oneness. Kelim is a different level of oneness because in the end it's a Kelim, but nonetheless it maintains that energy of Atzilus, of the Ein Sofness which exists with Atzilus, and therefore it's through Tzimtzum. But nonetheless it has that energy of Atzilus, which is a Lukus, and Huakav Tzimtzum Huakav Amalubish Min Aran Shalahem. This is the kav which is invested in the nefesh ruach neshama of them, which is the neshamis of the neshamis of nishmas ha'adam, or I would say maybe perhaps naran shalahem in the nefesh ruach neshama of these kelim datzilus. So here the Alter Rebbe goes, this is a subject on its own, and we spoke about it in the past. And we shouldn't take time to elaborate, because what the Alter Rebbe is saying over here, just to focus on what the Alter Rebbe is saying over here, there's something in between, that it's not the Il Va'ol connection. Conversely, it's not the very similar to the Il Va'ol connection as we spoke about in the last two classes. But certainly it's not B'riya V'yesh Mi'ayin. It's Neshamas. And because they're a result of the intimate setting by neshamas, zivuk nishikin, and by beyond that, neshamas ha'adam, which is through the intimate union of the spheres of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before they enter into B'riyat Seirasiyah, they're not a yeshiv davar finat, but they're kind of a manifestation of a lukus. Similar to the kelim of Yitzviris Datzilus, which is true, there's gvul, but nonetheless, it comes through the tzimtzum of the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the kav, which is invested in their nefesh ruach neshama. It's similar to the Tzimtzum Rishon Liyis Cholol, that in the end of the day, there's a connection between the Cholol to that pre-Tzimtzum state. Now, we're going to mention this in a moment. So what's the Alter Rebbe saying? That the way they their connection to a lukus, to godliness, because they're not part of the dynamic of Nivra, is they're always davik in lukus. And before we just explain this last part over here, we're just going to learn the brackets. He says, Av gam la'achar sheyordan aran da'atzilus lo'elam hazeh, that these neshamas, which again, this seems like to go back, it's not the name of the kelim, but it's the neshamas of this nefesh ruach neshama of atzilus, the way they were entered into elam hazeh, the tzaddikim mentioning to the tzaddikim, the tzaddikim of the yesteryears, which means the original tzaddikim, which existed in these many millennia of the establishment of Am Yisrael from the day of Yitzis Mitzrayim, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to them, and throughout the generations, especially the generations of Or, which means the generations of the past. There was Rish Tzadikim Rishayim, for example. He talked in the times of the Tanoim, as the Gemara said, these people were mezutu de b'chum achayim meisim. As an example, it says the smallest Tanya could have resurrected the passing, similar to the story we had with Elisha, as an example. Tchias amesim, it says even the smallest Tanya, even Amayraim, performed enormous nisim because they were so close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if it's this generation or other generations, but they were in the time in the original state of the establishment of Am Yisrael, and even later when the Tanoim and Amirayim, which this was generations of the greatest tzaddikim of all times, which was the norm, especially when the Beis Hamikdash stood. So these tzaddikim Arishonim, they lived on that level of where their neshamas came from, which is nefesh ruach neshama vatzilus, and even the way they entered into Elam Hazeh, reflective on the fact, as the Rebbe says, even though they came into Elam Hazeh. So some of you would argue that they obtained as they come down from Atzilus to Bria, to Yitzira, to Asiya, and then Asiya Gashmis is physical Asiya. We've never mentioned you spoke. This world of Asiya has its counterpart, and Asiya Ruchnis. So Neshama came down, so obtained apparently the Nivra dimension, but he says there's certain Tzaddikim Arishonim, they didn't. Now, this idea we find, you could see it clearly in the very beginning of Likutei Amarim, the second chapter. It's really a click away. The first segment, Likutei Amarim, the second chapter. It's been a while since then, but you can see it again. It's a click away on this site, tanyaonline.com. There, the Alter Rebbe writes that all the Neshamas, of course, come from the same place. Come from Hashem, and Hashem is Echad, Hashem is one. So how are there differences in neshamas, which there are? No one could say they compare their neshama to Avram's neshama and Yitzchak's neshama, or on top of everybody, Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. The Moshe Rabbeinu even and it goes on with a beautiful, beautiful example there. Again, you have to see it there. But in the end of the day, he says someone like a tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu, he was constantly tuned into the divine. He was never impacted. The fact that his neshama came down, which it did, it came down. It's Bri, Yitzira, Asiya. It gives the beautiful mashal of the phenomenon of pregnancy and the fetus, and there's certain parts of the fetus that the way they began, that's the way they enter into Elam Hazeh, and that was the Neshama Moshe. But you got to see it there. One of the most extraordinary examples that Alter Rebbe gives, which makes it so vivid. When you look at a tzaddik, you look at it's not just there's no comparison of a tzaddik and every other yid. Even he has neshama, and my neshama comes from the same place. The neshama of every yid comes from the same place of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. As Alter Rebbe begins the second chapter. It's part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem, there's Hashem Echad, one Hashem. So how can be the differences in souls? And Alter Rebbe explains again with that example. In the end of the day, you look at a tzaddik, it's distinct than any other yid because his neshama was never impacted. They were impacted by that entry and descent through the Olam as Bri, Yitzira, Asiya, and his Atzilus-ness, which exists because that's where his neshama comes from, is completely manifest even when it comes down into Elam Hazeh. And we found it by Moshe Rabbeinu, constantly tuned to the divine. And famously, the famous Gemara, Rashi brings the example to it, even from a certain perspective and point of view. Matan Torah was a total manifestation of that. Moshe is a godly person that he goes up to the mountain for 40 days. A human being can never do that, but Moshe Rabbeinu was a Isha Lekim, and the environment was a different environment in Shammai, meaning to say where Moshe was for the 40 days and 40 nights, again times 3. Receive the whole Torah. This is, of course, it's a phenomenon which is incomprehensible if you break it down. How could this all be possible? But the answer is because that's what Moshe Rabbeinu is. He's in a Neshama Atzilus. Even when it comes down to Elam Hazeh, he's still in a Neshama Atzilus. In other words, the Neshama Atzilus which exists within every yid is totally manifest. He's not impacted by that descent into Elam Hazeh. Constantly tuned to the divine. Therefore, he's always stands panim b'panim with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They say, but again, we explained that, how deep that is. But I say a constant sensory vision in Elokus vision. But one of the examples the Gemara brings, and again, this is perhaps even more than Matan Torah from a certain perspective and point of view, because this was like kind of a regular day. Can't say really a regular day with Moshe Rabbeinu ever in the desert where Yidden received the Torah, Haman. But Yidden complained that Hashem gave that first year Yidden to do the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and there was a whole group, Noshim Tmeim, Lenefesh Adam, and they said, they said, Moshe Rabbeinu, we can't do the Korban Pesach. Why should we lack in this important mitzvah? And again, the Gemara tells us who they are. They weren't a bunch of people which were careful in their state of Tumah V'Tayra. But nonetheless, they had a complaint. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, just a moment. Why don't you just tell you? I'll get back to you in a moment. Like someone takes a call here. Could you give me the information? I'll give. Really? Imdu v'eshma? And especially it speaks about in Sfarim, in particular, Primus HaTorah, what did Moshe Rabbeinu extract? Not just like a certain miracle. Moshe Rabbeinu, we need a miracle. We're stuck. Okay, give me a moment. I'll try to see if I can extract that miracle. That itself is also stupendous. You're so in tune to the divine. You say, hey, just give me a moment. Let me just try to extract the miracle from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he comes back and he performs the miracle. But this isn't beyond that. He extracts another mitzvah. Before that, there was only 612 mitzvahs. Now, in the Eibishter's mind, of course, there's 613. Torah mitzvahs are part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there's 613 mitzvahs, but nonetheless, on the surface, there wasn't this mitzvah as of yet. And Moshe Rabbeinu is able to extract a mitzvah, which means really a part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu within not only in a few seconds. It's not a matter only the time, but the circumstance. Even Doveshma, you have a complaint about Korban Pesach, just give me a moment. Then he comes back with a new mitzvah, Pesach Sheni. Really? That's beyond stupendous. That's something which doesn't begin to make sense. You're just talking to your people, to your flock, and of course you want to help them. You want to, but just a moment. Let me try. And he extracts with a moment. It's a new mitzvah, Pesach Sheni. And the Gemara says, and Asher means Ashrei Yiludisha. Why is the Gemara fortunate is someone who's born by natural birth that he could reach such a level of being so in tune to the divine? And why doesn't the Gemara say like in comparison, or rather by any other interaction of Moshe with the divine throughout the entire 40-year tenure of Moshe Rabbeinu, starting from Moshe Rabbeinu, Kibbutz Torah, Sinai, and all the other interactions with the divine, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the Torah is excited about, the Gemara is excited about this because this, if you look at the circumstance, the backdrop, Moshe talks about the mitzvah, okay? And there's certain Yidden, and again, the Gemara tells them where they are. They were very noble, they're noble reasons for their tumah. They carried the Arn of Yosef. The Gemara says who they were, different. But nonetheless, they turned to Moshe B'Lam and Moshe said, hold on, let me just. He extracts a total new mitzvah. So the Gemara says, wow, this is Ashrei Yiludisha. Look how fortunate Moshe Rabbeinu was that in no time he. In the backdrop, what seemed to be more of a natural setting, and right away he's able to extract a full mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni. And the answer is yes, because that's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's constantly in tune to the divine, because Moshe Rabbeinu was never impacted by the descent into Elam Hazah. And you see it there. Took the time to explain a bit more. That's who Moshe Rabbeinu is by default. So he says, similarly, those neshamas which came down to Elam Hazah, and they maintained the Atzilus Nis, if you will, even they came to Elam Hazah, after Shalin Shtan Mohusim leaves David Melukos, they never separated themselves. They never obtained that layer to be a Nivra, or a Neitzar, or a Nasa, at all. They maintained their Atzilus, spirited composure, to the extent never to be nifrid ben lukus, not be separate from lukus. Even not separate from lukus chas v'shalom in the context of sin, but just to not even to obtain that nivra neitza nasa dynamic. To the extent sometimes they came to a certain nisayin that they felt that there's something pulling, again from the perspective of their nefesh bahamis, Yitzhar hara. And they were so connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that to them the idea of sin was so negated. It is negated from the perspective of every nefesh alikis. Remember the famous saying of the Alter Rebbe, we spoke about it, we mentioned rather in the past, Ayid nicht will nicht ken sein abgerissen von Elokus. And Alter Rebbe deals with this in the end of Perik Yud Ches, L'kuti Amorim, click away, Yud Tes, and L'kuti Amorim, same, the next chapter, click away, other places as well. You can't, really from the perspective of Neshama, you can disconnect himself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But has it also, even in Chavdal 24, click away, towards the end of 24. But nonetheless, the phenomenon of sin ain't tzadik baratz shalei yechta, because nefesh bahamis could be mizgaber, strengthen itself over the person. But a person does tshuva because a yid always wants to be aligned seamlessly with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the inherent nature of the yid. But these people were so tied to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that when it came to such a situation, they had the temptation, they expired, they died, literally. Because the phenomenon of being separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which occurs through sin, this is the gravity of sin. Separate the yid, sever the connection of the yid with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Some of the person doesn't obey. That's why Abed is so negated. Which normal person would want to separate himself for a second, a millisecond even? Which of course you're talking about millisecond when it comes to thought, vision, audio. And we have complete control, as the Alter Rebbe writes, is one of the fundamentals of the Alter Rebbe's doctrine in Sefer Tanya Bechlal, but in the beginning chapters, in the beginning, first 15 chapters in Tanya, and he speaks about the Beinoni, Yud Beis, the way Hashem created the person who has full control, mind over heart, Chas v'Shalom, as the Alter Rebbe writes in Perik Yudalid. I never want to be Yudalid in Kuti Amorim. Also, click away. I never want to be disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A normal person never wants to be disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu even for a split second. Not even for a split second. The Alter Rebbe has it, and he goes on to explain this in the famous chapters between Yud Ches and Chavav. We spoke about this in a kind of special group a special message in these chapters that Yid had Mesiras Nefesh, even Chas v'Shalom, to disconnect from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, granted. But not always it manifests physically. Because the neshama itself adapted this veneer, at least, of Nivra, Neitzer, and Nasa. These neshamas, as they came down, when there was somewhat a Rotzu Lachti, B'terem Yechtu, before they would even, Chas v'Shalom, Nefesh Bahamis would have a Gabrus over them, Chas v'Shalom, to actualize this sin, they would literally expire, because that oneness was so manifest. This is the level of the neshamas of Atzilus, which were created, as he said before, which came into being through the union of the Hashem's Midas of Zoh and Malchus, and therefore, as they came into Elam Hazeh, without adapting the effect of Bri Yitzir Asiyah, they were stood constantly with that oneness, to the extent that they physically expired when there was a situation of sinning, and to sever the relation with the Kodesh was kind of an impossibility, and the only choice was to expire, and they so did. Because they didn't adapt the idea of Nivra. So again, just to say this importantly, that from the perspective of Neshama, even any other Neshama, a Yid nicht will nicht ken sein abgerissen. A person it doesn't begin to make sense. Would someone jump in fire? No. If they need a lesson or some courses to tell a person, don't jump into fires, no, you don't need it. It's innate, it's inherent. From the perspective of the neshama, doing a sin, even the smallest sin, which there really doesn't exist, it's just like jumping in the fire and beyond. Even for a millisecond to disconnect. Nefesh Kisechta says the Zeir Tama, how could it be? It's not Shaykh. The only problem is that the person, because he entered this same neshama, and it was impacted by the Bri Yitzir Asiyah phenomenon, which is the idea of Bri Yesh Miyayin, it remains the Chelik of the Kamimal Mamosh, but it carries, so to say, somewhat of a Nivra Neitzer Nasid layer to it, so therefore it's not constantly in tune. Innately, inherently it is, but sometimes the opacity of Eilam and the Nefesh Bahamis and the Guf, the bodily desires, animalistic desires, someone tried to cover it up and bring that confusion to it. The Ruach Shtus, as the Gemara says, and silly spirit of folly, a spirit of folly. It doesn't make sense. From the perspective of the neshama, it doesn't just make it's beyond jumping into fire, severing one connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A nefesh alikis, a godly soul which is one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to pull it, it's impossible. Problem is, by an average person, because again it obtained this nivra dimension, or neitzar, or nasa, so it doesn't have this, it doesn't express itself exactly the way these tzaddikim, because these tzaddikim, they maintained that Naran Atzilus even when they came down to Elam Hazah, and they weren't impacted by the Bri Yetzira Asiya phenomenon, which is generally Bri Yeshmian, and therefore Mistalkis Gratzulach, temptation, whatever it was. In other words, they came into a goof, so that's where the presentation of sin came about. But no, they expired right away, because what does it mean? To disconnect with them. They were neshamas that seals. That oneness was so demonstrable, or so potent by them, so overtly present by them, because they did not obtain this nivra idea, and therefore this is the way they lived. And if they had a situation, expire. And he goes on, there's another phenomenon like that. These are the tens of thousands and myriads of tens of thousands of worlds which sit in the skull of Arich Ampin. You know what it is? Good for you. Now, it's explained in Chassidus. It's not just words. The skull of Arich Ampin and Ze'er Ampin. And what is Arich Ampin? What is Ze'er Ampin? And what is the Galgalt of the skull? It's explained with a beautiful explanation. You learn Chassidus Chabad. These lofty terms become truly understandable. It's amazing what the Rabbeim did over here, and of course they brought Yidden, so to say, the preview into Yemaisa Mashiach, which then Yediyas Elokus, knowing the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, would be, in other words, the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be on the level of knowledge, not only wisdom and understanding. So you learn about this. These ideas are very clear, believe it or not, even to a simple person who learns Chassidus. But it would take a long time to explain. Arich Ampin literally means long faces. Ze'er Ampin means short, small faces. And of course, we're not talking about faces like we know faces in Elokus, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is beyond any image. But it's explained. This is the infinite energy of Keser, the crown of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which one of the levels of the crown of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's Arich Ampin and Atik Yomin, the latter, a deeper level within the Keser of Hashem. Not to go into it now. Ze'er Ampin is the Midas of Atzilus. And these are worlds which sit, so to say, in this Gulgulta, in this surrounding skull, just like the skull surrounds the whole image of the person. The skull is the highest part. So there's the skull of Arich Ampin, and then there's the Gulgulta of Zoh, which encompasses the entire Zoh, which are the Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And these are worlds which sit there. So again, it takes a long time, but we're not going to take the time right now. And you got to see it, find it, learn it. There's all my memorim, literally, of the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe's tens of other svarim, Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe wrote about 50 svarim. The Rebbe lived just about in 69 years, 68 years, 69 years, and his accomplishments were it doesn't begin to make sense. He was a Rebbe, he was a leader, and guided tens of thousands, immediate chassidim, and hundreds of thousands beyond, and a leader and an accomplisher, and whatever. And the Alter Rebbe wrote so much Torah. The Rab Shulchan Aruch, writing the Shulchan Aruch, is not just on the pirush of any other Shailas Tshuvos or any other commentary on Gemara or on Rishonim Achreinim. Shulchan Aruch is a different idea. How does a human being do that? We don't understand. And then he wrote about 50 svarim, and most of them in Teres Chassidus, and he himself explained these ideas and with much clarity. And then the subsequent Rabbeim, the Mittel Rebbe, and all the Rabbeim, the Rebbe Shavin is my mother, speak all about this. Again, you have to learn Chassidus Chabad. We must learn Chassidus Chabad to have that expansion on this which Am Yisrael is anticipating, Yediyas Elokus, that intimate connection of Nivra and Beire, the connection of Emes Hashem La'elam. It's not even like I'm not marketing a certain idea. You have to see it. Learn Tanya, learn Chassidus Chabad, it's a game changer from beginning to the end. There's not one aspect in one's life will not change, and again, not only for the good, a total qualitative difference in every aspect of that. Do they become Moshe Rabbeinu's or tzaddikim? Maybe why not? But it's not the objective. The whole Sefer, the original, when we say Tanya, is predominantly L'Kutei Amar. Al Rebbe called it Sefer Shel Beinanim. No one's demanding from the person to become a Moshe Rabbeinu or any other tzaddik, but it's a game changer in every single part of the person's life, the 24 hours of the person's life. And there's a certain inner simcha, pnimisdik is simcha, not a gemachter or a there's a certain inner contentment in the relation with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. There's order, there's discipline, there's times for tshuva and ma'asim tovim and Torah, and it's all, and we have to learn. A Yid has to learn Chassidus Chabad, and all the Chassidus, and even these ideas. Understand? You learn, and you look in the Zohar, and he speaks about the thousands of worlds that sit in the skull of Arich Hampin. It's beyond abstract, but when you learn Chassidus Chabad, it becomes really clear. And we're not going to go into it now because we're just going to go to the message. He says they're so close, these worlds with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're not Almin Mamash. They don't have that hell and Vehester with the generic Olam have, like the Heicholis, the Atzilus, the chambers of Atzilus, which we spoke about before, that even they're Atzilus, but they're not part of the energy of the Spheres, the Midas Atzilus. They are chambers, which is already adapt the idea of the separatism of the spirit and atmosphere of Olam Atzilus. They are not. They are Olamis, but they're not real Olamais, Meloshin Helam V'Hester, like it says in Gemara Erevin, that Olam is Meloshin Helam V'Hester. These are not Almi Mamish like the chambers of Atzilus, but they are similar to those neshamas of the Malachim. Not even neshamas of the Yid. Neshamas of the Yid is much deeper. That's why I said neshamas is just Yotzim Zivuk and Nishikin. Repeats this over here again. It's the intimate setting, doesn't have that intimate union which produces the neshama. Therefore, neshama of the Yid is the deepest. But it's similar to the neshamas of the Malachim, these worlds, and they're so close, and they're so demonstrably one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they never adapt that idea of Nivra, which Al Rebbe speaks about in this chapter, previous class before, the whole phenomenon of ex nihilo, Bria Yesh Miyayin, which is a paradoxical idea. On one hand, Hashem is Mahava Mechayim Mekayim, gives everything life and existence every single second. Nonetheless, the Nivra does not demonstrate that, nor inherently, nor innately, nor overtly, nor covertly as well. Then the Yid has to introduce the Emes Hashem La'ilam, which is again the whole phenomenon of B'riyah Yesh Miyayin, which is spoken about so many times, but here in this chapter, which again, this is by design and precision, because Baruch Hu wants a dira b'tachteinim, and the tachtin on its own should not demonstrate the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, despite it's constantly vivified by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the extent we say Ex Nihilo doesn't have anything else other than the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu which makes it exist, and if HaKadosh Baruch Hu pull back the energy, it would cease to exist, literally disappear, yet it doesn't demonstrate the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu at all. Aniya Eili, B'lias Isoni is default in Elam Haza, and the Yid has to introduce the Emes Hashem Leilam. All this does not have, they did never obtain it, nor these neshamas namely the neshamas of the Yid. In these types of neshamas, which never obtained the Bri Yitzira Siya veneer. And even neshamas of Malachim, which there wasn't an intimate union mamash, but as if you kind of shiking, which is kind of intimate setting. So therefore, the production of the neshamas, these malachim, have that drive, or they're always part of that oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Alter Rebbe, these olamis, they might be called almin, as he says nika almin, in comparison to the Golgotha and the Dikna, which is the skull. Dikna literally means the beard, which is again also explained in Chassidus based on the psukim in Tanakh regarding HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud Gimel Tikuni Dikna, which again, this is just a very important, that's why the Odom is called Adam El Elyon. That's why the beard is called Tselem Elikim, maintaining the beard the way it is. Tselem Elikim, a person really connects to the Kaviyochel, the Yud Gimel Tikuni Dikna, Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, which are called the strands of the beard of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, it's a metaphor, euphemistically saying, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have an image, but in the idea, it's a very high level in Kedusha, which is the reason why the beard is called Tselem Elikim, and not to touch a beard even. much more so, not to take it away, whatever, not to go into it now, but a person knows that that's where his real connection with the most deepest levels of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But this, he says, this is the Gulgula and the Dikna, the skull and the Dikna, skull also all-encompassing Koyach of Hashem. That you understand when you think about the skull, it's literally physically the highest level within the human organism, human being, because it represents and it's all-encompassing, which is that which corresponds to the all-encompassing dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is a deep level, a high level within HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. The Dikna also coming, Yud Gimel Tikunik Diknet, Yud Gimel Midas Arachamim, which are very deep level within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is associated with the Atik, even the higher level of Keser, which you just mentioned. So these Olamis are called Olamis in comparison to the Galgalta and Dikna, but they're not the generic Olamis. They're not Nifred from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're similar to the Neshamas of the Malachim, as opposed to the actual Eilam Abriya, Yitzira. That's when the Eilam, Sheba Eilam, comes in, especially Yitzira and Nasiya and Eilam Azagashmi. The Eilam, the Helam Behester, that's real Helam Behester. That's really where the whole idea of the Briya Shmiyayin comes in, as he explained before. As opposed to these Eilam is a different story. They're constantly so much part of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe continues, says, yet they don't have the ability to create Yeshmiyayin because that's a deeper level of Hashem. As we will go on, and so if you read away, you see there's the levels of this which creates Yeshmiyayin, enormous Kayach. Then there's the Ila Va'olul. Then there's these levels of Neshamas HaMalachim, deeper yet Neshamas of Neshama of the Yid. And then you have these Eilamis which are similar to the level of the Neshamas of Malachim. And then you have the actual Briya, the Briya itself. Not the Kayach to be Bayre, but the Briya itself. Later, Bez Hashem, is going to speak about the Kayach to be Bayre. It comes from a very, very deep level. We'll look forward in the coming class. Have a wonderful night.